Conscient Podcast, episode 170. Sonic Research Group, part 2.
It just soundwalking is always like magic. It is a magical experience. It is so simple, Hildi, as you said. And it is as much about listening to sounds or listening to absences of sound. It's not very typical in our lives. We don't live the kinds of lives that require this kind of presence. And so it's so restorative for me and calms my spirit, but also it's such a reminder each and every time I do a sound walk of the power of just simply listening, opening up that register in um, all of its span from appreciation to analytics to criticality to spirituality.
This is part 2 of a conversation with colleagues and friends from the Sonic Research Group at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia. This time with Milena Droumeva, Hildegard Westerkamp, Barry Truax, Jacek Smolicki, Freya Zinoviev, and myself. You might have heard part 1, episode 157, where we explained that the Sonic Research Group is a bi-monthly Zoom gathering of acoustic ecology researchers, activists, and artists from around the world, where we talk about sound studies and our shared passion for listening. Now, this second conversation was recorded on April 30th, 2024, while I was in Vancouver. And it flows freely on a range of issues and topics. For example, Milena talked about stages of life.
I think stage of life is really an important thing. I mean, it just really matters if you're in a stage of life where you're a young person who has to find a place in the world, or if you're a parent of young children and you're as yourself are aging or entering a kind of middle age, you have to think about the futures of kids. And I think there's work to do at every stage.
We also talked about sound and artificial intelligence, and I'm sure we'll revisit this topic. In fact, how do you even know that I'm human? This could easily be a synthetic voice, right? Jacek, please help us.
Perhaps what differentiates us from the machines that we make is precisely the historical consciousness. Like machines will never be able to be historically aware. I mean, we observe it a lot with how algorithms are operating using biased and skewed data without considering the context within which this data emerged. So I think our roles as educators is to be those kind of reminders of certain historical contexts from which the material that this whole machinery is digesting and using to produce the futures comes from.
Education in sound and listening was a through line in our conversation, as Barry Truax observed.
I'm still cautiously optimistic that we could still use those same techniques that we've used in the past to create a more creative and analytical and critical listener.
We seem to share a common interest and passion for sound walking. Hildegard Westerkamp notes.
The kind of magic that happens to listen together to something is this connection to community. It's almost as if a group becomes a community, even though we don't know each other from the start, and that it creates an atmosphere of willingness to be open. We feel it inside ourselves, that grounding. And if we're connecting in that context to others, we can get to that energetic place because we've slowed down.
And you can hear more about soundwalking in previous Conscient podcast episodes, notably episode 22 with Hildegard Westerkamp, episode 78 with Milena Droumeva, and episodes 113A and B with Jacek Smoligi. We also talked about current affairs, and on that day in Vancouver there was an encampment at the University of British Columbia about the war in Gaza and calls for disinvestment. And Freya told us a story which I found quite, I guess, funny and disturbing. You'll hear me laugh at the end of it.
I don't know if anyone heard about a music teacher at Columbia recently who was teaching John Cage's 433. And they made a big fuss about how they couldn't teach that class because there was, in their words, the lusty chanting of protest outside the classroom. And all she could hear was from the river to the sea. And she said, okay, this just means we can't teach this now because it's ruining 433. So we have to just continue reminding ourselves and others that listening is a community project and we need to learn together how to listen to what is actually there.
We also discussed the sound of air conditioning system in urban spaces as a symptom of climate change and the media practices of neo-Nazi groups, and much more. Enjoy. Conscient Podcast, episode 170. I'm again with the Sonic Research Group, led by Milena Droumeva at Simon Fraser University, and this is part 2. Those of you who listened to part 1, episode 157, will get a continuation. Those who are here for the first time, well, welcome to our world, our sonic world. So I've been part of this group for a couple more years, and it's every second Tuesday we get together, group of acoustic ecologists and sound researchers to talk about what's on our mind and exchange freely. So that's what's going to happen today. 4 of us were here for part 1 and 2 of us were not. So that's a nice group. We'll hear from everyone, just a quick introduction, and then I'll ask Jacek and Freya to just speak their mind, what they think about the questions I sent, which is around the questions of this 5th season of the podcast, and then just see where it goes in terms, as we usually do in this forum. So my name's Claude Schreier. I'll pass it just to everyone. I'll just say quick name, what you do, where you are, and then we'll jump in. Milena, why don't you go next?
Sounds good. Thank you, Claude. My name is Milena. I am an associate professor at Simon Fraser University, and I'm joining from Vancouver, or the Musqueam territories.
I'm Hildi, Hildegard Westerkamp. I am retired, I think, but I'm also really busy and concerned, very, very busy these days, and very concerned about what's happening sonically in this city right now. And maybe I'll talk a little bit more at one point about that.
Professor Barry Truex, Professor Emeritus at Simon Fraser University, composer, educator, and researcher in acoustic communication and everything to do with sound.
Right on.
Hi, I'm Jacek. I'm an artist and researcher and educator based in Stockholm and affiliated with Uppsala University at the moment, where I'm researching. And I'm interested in ways of listening, both technologically mediated and kind of diverse ontologically speaking.
Everyone, I am joining you from Vancouver. and the unceded territories of the Salish peoples. I'm a PhD candidate at Simon Fraser University, and my work looks at the intersections of violence and sound and ideas about nationhood. Yeah, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. Thanks for hosting us, Claude.
Well, since you just spoke, Freya, do you mind starting and just sharing some thoughts with us?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would love to share is that I went to the encampment at UBC yesterday. I don't know if anyone's been up there yet.
How was
but
it?
it was so beautiful. It was peaceful, it was generative, it was kindly, it was very organized. There were teach-ins, there were art making workshops, maybe 200-ish people. I heard some very brilliant speakers. They have it all fenced off, and many different tents in there. They've got a food tent, just super organized. So I think this is what's happening across campuses right now is really at the forefront of my mind, and of course the genocide that's going on, and the silence of our institutions in relation to that genocide, and how do we listen in relation to the silence and the propaganda that is being perpetuated through our media. And yeah, so if anyone gets the chance to go up to the encampment at UBC, it's very beautiful up there. They need supplies, they need support, and I highly recommend a visit.
Can you explain to listeners what the demands or the main issue is of that encampment and the others?
Sure. So they're asking for UBC to divest. So UBC and all universities, most universities, invest in companies that support the Zionist regime, and of course do research with Israeli universities. So they're asking for those investments and research projects to cease.
Jacek, do you want to just have a couple of opening thoughts, and then when people have extra comments, just jump right in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe before addressing those questions that you generously shared with us, I will also just maybe say a few words about what I've been up to these days. Maybe, I've been quite a lot invested in writing, and maybe it's a form of escapism from what is happening around us these days. I've been writing about time machines and the kind of media archaeology of time machines, trying to problematize AI and certain developments within AI as kind of new forms or new instances of time traveling machines. And the way that I understand them as time traveling machines is that basically artificial intelligence draws heavily on past data, the data has been accumulated historically. So we are kind of inherently being sent to historical periods without even knowing necessarily that we are there. And at the same time, AI is all about the future. Yeah, AI, the majority of narratives talk about AI as this very future-oriented endeavor, that will help us, that will save us, that will revolutionize our lives and so on. And we are somehow lost, a grasp of the present in this picture, I think. So I'm also looking into, I'm more interested in arguing that there might be more problems with how AI is rendering the past rather than how AI is rendering the future. And one kind of example is the deepfake technology that allows us to create evidence of something that didn't happen. And in the future, when we talk from the perspective of future generations, it will be harder and harder with kind of shrinking historical consciousness to differentiate between historical evidence and a deepfaked evidence, for instance. So this is something I've been writing about recently, also thinking about sound. There is, of course, predominant focus on the visual when it comes to AI, and also the very terminology that we use to think about AI, the envisioning and so on. But it's, I think, interesting to ask a question about what kind of sonic realities does the AI promise, and what kind of sonic realities in this manufacturing of the future it relies on, what kind of sonic realities it also obscures and silences.
Well, I remember you and a few others at the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology conference in Florida talking about this, and some of the younger people were not as terrified as I was. And I was interested by that. They see potential in AI as well as the threats. There's this kind of double-edged sword, So it's an area that I haven't heard a lot about in terms of sound, though it is obviously a dimension. We could spend all of our session today just talking about that, but it's connected to other pieces of technology, right? This group often talks about the ethics of science and the ethics of technology. So they're all interrelated, but AI is just this big elephant in the room, right?
But isn't this really, just to come back, sorry to jump in, this is Milena, to come back to your main question, to me, these are the two main trajectories of building a future at the end of the world. And one is through this incredible community building that Freya was describing. I mean, I think the way that people are organizing on the ground and in really, really real ways, and with community guidelines, and with just so much preparation and care. We love to, in academia, talk about its problems, and this is a really fascinating way to frame these problems, Jacek. Thank you for this. It's gonna keep me busy thinking about it for a while, but yeah, I'm absolutely terrified of that kind of future, of that AI future. But it totally has sonic dimensions. There's been a couple of technologies I talk about in the classroom often, of products that have been so powerful they've been pulled off the market, like Adobe Voice, and another recent one that I think just kind of got discontinued as well, where you can just feed a little bit of somebody's speech, less than 2 minutes. I mean, I think there's some AIs that even can work with 30 seconds of someone's speech, and then they can replicate, they can deep fake someone, a real person, saying all kinds of things, anything. You just text to speech it, but it sounds like the real person. So more implementations of voice and forensics, or precise voice recognition in a kind of forensic sense. So like questions around truthiness and authenticity through voice are only emergent and beginning, and are going to be a big deal sonically from now on, to say
Yes.
nothing of the soundscape.
It's sort of like photocopying a million times bigger, right? You remember years ago we had very small issues with, is this the original or is this a copy?
Right.
It's kind of the same idea.
Yeah, I would just jump in. Indeed, Milena, there's this whole phenomenon of voice cloning, and I think in the US, as far as I'm concerned, it's considered to be one of the most frequently performed type of fraud, digital fraud these days. Replicating someone's voice and then calling their loved ones, saying that I need some money, please can you transfer money, or I'm being taken hostage, or so on. And there's more and more of those calls being just happening with with AI being heavily kind of integrated into it. And another interesting example is from the war in Ukraine, where maybe you've heard of it. The Russian hackers created a deep fake of Zelensky, who was calling the nation to surrender, basically. Of course, it was quite easily questioned, luckily, because there were hackers on the other side who were able to claim that this is a deep fake. But I think we are really getting into a very kind of shady territory. And just today, I was reading there's an MIT project that apparently reached a level of, now we can of course debate the realism of those deepfakes, that is almost entirely indistinguishable from reality, especially for digitally native young people and so on, for whom the world is primarily mediated via digital means.
It just feels like we're losing more and more ground, and that AI is symbolic to that. I can't get my brains around it. I find it absolutely terrifying too. And yet, yes, it has potential as like any tool. It could be used in really wonderful ways. The thing that really strikes me is that we can't sort of believe our senses anymore. And that's what's frightening, because how can we not? We're listening, and we it's a bit crazy making. It makes something like the invitation to come on a sound walk almost too simple. Too like, what are we doing going on a sound walk while people in Gaza don't see a tree in sight, only see destruction, only see wounds. How do we bring that together? And I want to bring up this what I said earlier on is about the city. I have a personal issue here, right next door, where a new house is being built, and it seems completely a luxury issue. It seems completely unimportant in the face of all this, and yet to me it connects directly to the problems we are having with climate crisis and everything else. And that is 2 air conditioners outside, big air conditioner boxes outside of a new smart house, which apparently the city is requiring everyone now to have air conditioning or heat pump or both. One of them was broken, or whatever was going on. It suddenly came on a very cool day, off and on for weeks. And I was trying to talk to the owner, and they were good enough to engage with me and are continuing to engage with me. But the problem is not that something was broken with the thermostat. The problem is that they're really noisy, and they're right next door to my garden, next door to my front porch. And 2 people came to check out the one in the front that was not broken. And I said, I'm really worried. And while we were talking, shouting at each other while this machine was going, it stopped. And I said, listen to that. Listen to the difference. This is what I'm talking about. Yeah, but that's what they all sound like. That's what they are, lady. Get used to it. And this is a result of climate crisis. Now the city requires air conditioning in residential areas, in new houses. It's like an invasion, a sonic invasion, because of the climate crisis. And this is probably a cheap version. It's not very well made. What do you do, right? My brain is connecting it all in one thing: the camp at UBC, Gaza, climate crisis, air conditioning next door.
Well, they are interconnected. And when we had our heat pump put in Ottawa, we talked to our neighbors and we had a reading of how loud it would be, and we tried to place it in the best place possible. And we essentially asked for their consent, because maybe we wouldn't have done it had it been highly disruptive. But that's in an ideal situation where you have good, you can have that kind of communication. But I think it's partially that, and partially, finding ways to cool the houses through in other ways, and maybe just using sporadically in the moments of extreme heat. Then maybe it makes sense,
Exactly.
especially for elderly people. There's a health issue there.
Yeah, it's an ongoing negotiation, and the people have been good in terms of listening to me and discussing it, and possibly talking to the city and making it a larger issue also. And then when the heat comes, let's see how much it's actually being used.
Well, I would like to invite Freya to talk a bit more. You alluded to the sort of right-wing speech research you were doing, and I'm quite interested in that because it's a topic that I doesn't come up very much on my podcast, and you're an expert. So what are some of the issues and what are some of the questions in your research?
Oh, thanks, Claude. Well, I have a project for the last couple of years. I've been looking at neo-Nazism in Canada, and specifically cross-border links between neo-Nazi groups here and in the US, and looking at how they utilize sound for their project. So particularly interested in how they use sound in their propaganda videos, how they use sound in their podcasts, and yeah, so how sound enables the transmission of specific ideologies in relation to right-wing extremism.
Your research will be available in due time, and
Yes.
I'll link to it and all that. It's an interesting topic because the left wing, right wing, but we're not talking about just sort of people's opinions. We're talking about a more extreme version of a type of propaganda, I guess, and there's propaganda everywhere. But
yeah,
so I guess it's a question of understanding, what it sounds like and how the sounds are being perceived. Like, how are people receiving this, and do they have access to other sources of information and knowledge that would counterbalance points of view and all that?
Well, yeah, and I guess it just goes back to this central question of what is real. How do we know what is real or not?
Exactly.
Right?
Circles back to this, like, how can we ever believe any media anymore?
Yes. Yeah, and we can't, if our mainstream media sources are mainly propaganda these days, which I believe they are, we have nothing to rely on anymore.
And these folks have been sort of suspicious for a long time. I mean, they've been, I don't want to say paranoid, but they've been duly suspicious and mistrustful of mainstream media for a long time. And so they've created these enclaves and
right. And I don't know if anyone saw last week, there was a neo-Nazi march. I believe it was in Florida. There've been quite a few there recently, but they were openly marching through the streets. It was a group called the Blood Tribe, and there was maybe 30 of them with their banners marching through the streets, completely free. The police were holding people back so they could march freely. And at the same time, we have students at Columbia being kettled, tear gassed, and there are snipers on the roof there, imposing violence on these students. So we have to ask ourselves, what's going on here? Who is the violent one in this situation?
the illusion of this sort of extreme American version of freedom of speech, but the softer Canadian version of freedom of speech and, freedom of expression, like the illusion is really shattering. It's so obvious at this point in time. But yeah, I've just become really fascinated with I know the public sphere has been breaking down for a long time, and social media and platformization has really contributed to these fragmentations, but I don't know. I feel like deep fakes and AI is further breaking it even to a further level. Scary. I think to summarize, it's kind of really difficult to get to this next stage of preparing for the end of the world without fully understanding and parsing out all the problems and all the issues that are currently happening. And I will come back to something that we talked about in the first part of this discussion, which is, I think, stage of life is really an important thing. I mean, it just really matters if you're in a stage of life where you're a young person who has to find a place in the world, or if you're a parent of young children and you're as yourself are aging or entering a kind of middle age, you have to think about the futures of kids, or whether you're at a more senior stage of your life with a lot of accomplishments behind you and with some power still or some influence still. And I think there's work to do at every stage, but I think the perspective is different in terms of like how well we can access that feeling of like, I think what you talk about a lot, Claude, is like that sort of calm acceptance. It's difficult when you feel more called in your stage of life to be part of critical current issues. I feel called to be at these protests, and I'm sad to say I haven't made it to one yet, although I have made it to some at my institution, but and I'm participating there, but and much of my lifestyle kind of prevents me from really being there as much as I would like to be.
Well, just this morning on Facebook, which I have issues with, but it's there. There's a boycott of Loblaws going on, being prepared for the month of May because of
Right.
their price policies. And then I wrote in that posting, imagine a month-long boycott of fossil fuels or technology or any other issue around us. It's unimaginable, right? Because we're so ingrained, but it's not impossible and it's not unimaginable. It's just a stretch. So I was happy to see people boycotting things that they believe to be unfair, and we should be doing a lot of more of that because there's power in the people. You know, there used to be so many more protests, and people are feeling disempowered and discouraged. And I hear you about young people. I have a couple of young adults, children, and we talk a lot about their future, and they're cautiously optimistic that things will turn around, at a certain point. I think it'll be in a moment of crisis. We're already in a crisis. It'll be a worse crisis, but then we need to learn how to live in and through those crises because that's what's ahead of us. And it doesn't mean necessarily a horrible life. It just means a different life, I think. But you're right. I'm an older person and I always try to check my assumptions because what do I know about a young person's feelings, right? Other than
Oh, it
don't.
was not a criticism, Claude. I think
No, but it's fair enough.
no, but it was not a criticism. I really mean that as like there's work to be done at every stage, and I think mentorship is going to be really important. Like eldership, mentorship.
It's an interesting thought. I think a lot about that a lot. And, there's this feeling of that some of what we've developed and learned, it's not irrelevant, but it needs to change in its presentation, in the language that we speak about it. And I certainly feel getting older that I don't have the energy to be an activist the way I used to be. And so then how do you speak about listening or the like the post-capitalist or late stage capitalist world at this stage? What keeps me grounded is to think that things are cyclical. And so what I'm seeing now feels like what I've heard before I was born in Europe and the war. It feels like the time of the Vietnam War with the protests when I came over here and in '68, and there were the incredible protests, and it felt like the end of the world in many respects as well. And maybe sometimes it's necessary to feel that urgency in order to make real changes. We thought we were making a lot of changes. We thought we were changing the world. And a lot of what we did actually pushed things into the dangerous direction. I'm thinking of Obama, who was such a hopeful figure for all of us when he came in. And because of his race, I think things got pushed into more extremist situation by the right wing. He was such a challenge to so many people. It's a simplistic way of talking about it, but I think to be faced by extreme right-wing people, by a Black president every day, must have pushed things even further. There was an urgency for them. And now we're in this situation. I always think about it, that somehow this pendulum idea is just gone very, very far. And now we're feeling the urgency. And what do we do with that urgency? How do we listen to that and then act from that, no matter what age we are?
Well, and the previous episode to this one was with a social innovator, Louise Adongo, and she talked about slowing down, but she didn't, because there's a famous Bayo Komalafe saying that the world is urgent, we need to slow down. But she sort of worked through what it meant to slow down. It doesn't mean to stop acting. It just means to deepen our reflection and be more purposeful in what we do. So it's a kind of slowing down of the madness, but an acceleration of whatever you want to call it, actions that are responsive, that are both short and long term. There are ways to position.
My perspective on what the slowing down means is that we really need to think more deeply before we take the actions, which is different than let's slow down and not take any actions at all. I
still believe that the accumulation of efforts in the world will have an effect, because there is this reawakening now after COVID. But in terms of this conversation, last time we did talk a lot about listening, and you, Hildi, talked about how we need to, how did you say it exactly? Listen to the things that we don't want to listen to. And that really struck me. I put it at the beginning of the episode. I thought this is such a rich thought, and it's not hard to do. You just have to stretch your listening a little bit more. So as we wrap up here, I know you haven't spoken yet, Barry. You might have thoughts, I don't know, but how does this connect to listening? Because that's what we are most specialized in terms of acousticology and listening and soundscapes. How then do we change or adapt our listening practices to all the issues we just talked about today?
Yes, this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, also from the position of being at an age of mentorship, I think is reasonable to say, after 50 years of doing this. I want to go back to this specific issue of the deep fakes in AI, because the historical perspective, now, I have to preface this by saying I am not going to minimize the risks and the fear that we are talking about. Anything that I say or historical examples, though, do have a possibility of how we've been through something similar before and what efforts were within our capabilities of trying to do something about it, right? So the deep fakes and AI is simply the latest in a very long series of algorithmic-based approaches, right? And in music, for instance, 70 years ago, in the 50s and the 60s, this was applied to the lowest hanging fruit, you might say, which was instrumental music composition and notation. And it was low hanging in the sense that you didn't have to produce sound, which was very difficult at that point. You could just produce notation, right? And so the corpus of classical music and of popular music was analyzed for its underlying rules and patterns, and composers started using it to create, quote, new works, sometimes in the style of past masters and sometimes new. And there was the predictable public moral panic. Oh my God, creativity, it sort of exposed the paradigm of the dead white male European, genius, right? And said, well, it's not magical, it's not necessarily, irrational. There is an irrational component to it. And so educators and composers could serve two possible roles, two services, besides just simply analyzing perhaps a bit better what was going on. The first thing was they could use it to produce new things, right, and not just simulate old things. And this is, of course, the paradox of the computer. It can literally only do what it can be programmed to do, and then it takes a more creative approach to extend that. But it does clarify what can be algorithmized, that's not a word, that can be programmed, and what might be the more human thing. Now, that was, for me as a young composer, that was very liberating. There was that algorithms were a tool and that they needed to be guided and so on and so forth. And the same thing can happen in two different ways. Now, whether this is, of course, the stakes, is this just a matter of degree, or is it really the danger is of kind? So I would hope that, first of all, artists might engage in this in a way that could show some positive benefits. Okay. And educators can have a role with analytical listening and education to advance our listening abilities. And over the audio century that we've lived through, we have gone, it's listening that has changed, not just the technology. Analytical listening, to be able to repeat, to analyze, to be critical of sound qualities, all of these things that were impossible, for instance, in the so-called Edison tone tests in 1915-18, where people couldn't tell the difference between a scratchy gramophone record and the real singer, right? They learned how to tell the difference. Now we say these deepfakes are indistinguishable, but I'm not entirely convinced that there isn't the possibility of a change of listening competence, or at least a skepticism. For instance, in most of my teaching program in communication on the audio side, there was a fair amount of it given to illustrating voices of persuasion, which was basically advertising, but also other forms of rhetoric, right? And so we started listening to what was designed not to be listened to analytically, the ads in the background of a radio or a television or something like that, right? And once you bring them to the fore of people's attention, then you can get them to analyze how these voices have been manipulated, standardized, enhanced, the rhetoric. You can get them to listen to it more critically, right? And some of these voices of persuasion were very powerful because they existed. Their home turf was background media, right? They're simply being absorbed without uncritically, right? And they were forming a consumer-based consciousness. And so now, is that enough to move it into the 21st century? Well, it's not a bad start, right? And it does give me hope that educators can, and that the public in general, can learn to be more analytical about these things by their contextual knowledge and so on and so forth. Whether that's enough to, counter all of the abuses that are already going on, and you quoted those or not. But in terms of listening, it requires analytical listening, contextual listening, critical listening, and it can change. It has changed over the last century to even at a general, public level. So whether that's enough to give us hope, I don't know, because the stakes do seem to be a lot higher and so on and so forth. But they've been high contextually in the past as well. And it's interesting that that period that I'm talking about of this kind of teaching about analytical listening and critical listening, the forces that were propelling it, the consumer industry, were pretty high. And we're also, as we always are, dealing in the fact that listening is not paid much attention to, and that never changes. And from generation to generation, I mean, there's an acceptance of the status quo. So I think it behooves artists and educators to get in there and also not just do the usual thing, which is the visual aspect and the textual aspect, but why not address the listening aspect? Because as usual, it's the last to be addressed, right? So I'm still cautiously optimistic that we could still use those same techniques that we've used in the past to create a more creative and analytical and critical listener.
Oh, and I hear you. And it goes back to what Hildi said about what are we not listening to and what are some of the barriers to listening to those things that we need to know. And I was thinking also when sounds disappear, we would notice that in our body mind that there's an absence and we would yearn for those sounds to return. We're about out of time for our part two of this conversation, but I'd like to give everybody a last chance to either comment on what anyone else has said or any final thoughts, because luckily for us, this is an ongoing conversation. Every 2 weeks we talk about it, but I won't impose on our listener a third part right now, but maybe in a year we could revisit and see, what has changed in the world, what has changed in our own research and thinking. But let's just do around the way we did at the beginning and just see if there's anything to add. Do you want to start, Milena?
Sure. Thank you, Claude, for giving me this opportunity or giving us this opportunity for this conversation. I guess I want to, as my last comment, just to say on this last topic of listening and what is the role of sound in listening, I feel very turbulent always in my mind. I want to do more. I feel a lot more ambition than I'm able to do. I'm not a lover. I'm a fighter. I don't it's not in my nature to like stop and be calm. So I just want to acknowledge that every time I did a sound walk as part of the podcasting Amplifies podcasting school last week. And it just sound walking is always like magic. It is a magical experience. It is so simple, Hildi, as you said. And it is as much about listening to sounds or listening to absences of sound. It's not very typical in our lives. We don't live the kinds of lives that require this kind of presence. And so it's so restorative for me and calms my spirit, but also it's such a reminder each and every time I do a sound walk of the power of just simply listening, opening up that register in all of its span from appreciation to analytics to criticality to spirituality. So I'll stop there to give everyone a chance to add something.
Sure, that's very moving. Thank you. Hildi?
I could go on with that too, Milena. Experience has shown us that sound walking is grounding and connecting context, where when we do it in a group, the kind of magic that happens to listen together to something is this connection to community. It's almost as if a group becomes a community, even though we don't know each other from the start, and that it creates an atmosphere of willingness to be open. And so if we create, like Barry was talking about the educational context, if we create frameworks of that kind of listening, that's where hope can be, because we feel it inside ourselves, that grounding. And if we're connecting in that context to others, we can get to that energetic place because we've slowed down. It's easy for me as an older person to say to slow down, but when you look at the lifestyle of young families, I mean, it's not slow. But there are moments where one can connect as a community inside the family through that listening, like you were saying, Milena, about talking about AI. You wrote that you have conversations about how all the creative jobs in the future will be done by AI. I mean, I think that's a topic to slow down over and listen to that and figure out from that perspective. Those moments in family life with my younger generation here too are really important. And so there are moments of just being together and slowing down. So and that listening goes on and on and on. It never changes throughout life, and there's always learning in listening. So I should have known.
Thank you. I'll also remind people that there's episodes with Milena and Hildi and Jacek on the podcast. Jacek.
Yeah, so many thoughts to respond to, so many interesting observations here, and I will maybe get back to what Barry said, which I think is super crucial in terms of finding ourselves within this, ever more complicated reality, where the fake and the real, converge. And I totally agree that the analytical gaze is necessary, and for that we need the wisdom of older generations as well, because what we need to make those differentiations is the context, is the historical context, or what I call historical or techno-historical consciousness, for instance. And in this paper, one of the conclusions that I try to offer is that perhaps what differentiates us from the machines that we make is precisely the historical consciousness. Like, machines will never be able to be historically aware, will never be able to to draw on historical context in order to evaluate the data that they work with, for instance, right? And I mean, we observe it a lot with how algorithms are operating using biased and skewed data without considering the context within which this data emerged. So I think our roles as educators is to be those kind of reminders of certain historical context from which the material that this whole machinery is digesting and using to produce futures comes from. So that's my response to Barry, and I also wanted to relate to what Hildegard said, and this will be probably the only moment where I disagree with Hildi, which is that you mentioned that your activism decreased over time, and I wouldn't agree with you. Unfortunately, I think your activism is still there. Simply your presence within the discourse is a form of even radical activism, and I think we should really all cherish this. And last thought also that kind of pertains to what Hildegard said and the air conditioning scenario. I had this picture, Hildi, when you were describing this, that I totally agree that all these layers are so interconnected. It's just a matter of paying attention to them and listening to them. So I just propose this image as the kind of an ending thought, where we see a city, a modern city, within which we have this, massive amount of air conditioning systems here and there. And at the same time, we have all these new developments within machine listening, where you have all the surveilling technologies listening to the city, or trying to listen to the city, and trying to listen to certain tropes. We know that those machine listening systems are also designed to search for concrete clues, like, the sounds of crimes happenings and dialects and so on. But paradoxically, these air conditioning systems create a shield for people to hide under and conspire against that kind of machine-driven society. and come up with new scenarios for maybe, creating cities and realities of different kind. So, just to kind of maybe end with a little bit more positive note that we can turn those deficiencies and mistakes of the past into something that works towards better futures.
Freya.
Thank you. So, yeah, I think my parting thoughts are building on what everyone has said, just the continued need to develop together pedagogical practices and frameworks for listening as a community project, and how we listen to what is actually there. I don't know if anyone heard about a music teacher at Columbia recently who was teaching John Cage's 433. And they made a big fuss about how they couldn't teach that class because there was, in their words, the lusty chanting of protest outside the classroom. And all she could hear was "from the river to the sea." And she said, okay, this just means we can't teach this now because it's ruining 433. So we have to just continue reminding ourselves and others that listening is a community project, and we need to learn together how to listen to what is actually there. And I'll leave it at
that. Barry, mood left.
Just to summarize, I think the process that has sustained us for so long is still valid, and we have to hope it can continue and become more developed, which is starting with oral awareness, then critical evaluation, and then the creation of alternatives, right? Whether they're doing less or doing different. It's a general pattern that has worked well for us in the past, and we just need to keep updating it and exploring it, I hope.
Well, thank you all for this almost hour now of conversation. I really appreciate it, and I think our listeners will as well. And I invite listeners to comment, if there are things you want to question, and ongoing conversations are important. Thank you so much.